welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this Zoom for a discussion of 2 pathways to 30 by 30, specifically pathway 4 and 7. My name is Melanie Schlotterbeck, and I will be moderating this session today for Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks. And you'll see we are in webinar format on the Zoom platform, and this means that the icons at the bottom may be a little bit different than you normally see. Today's content is being live simulcast in Spanish, and now our interpreter will translate this introduction before being moved into the Spanish audio channel.
Bienvenidos a todos, gracias por unirse a este Zoom para una discusión sobre 2 caminos hacia 30 por 30, específicamente el 4 y el 7. Mi nombre es Melanie Schlotterbeck y hoy moderaré esta sesión para amigos de puertos, playas y parques, Friends of Harbors, Beaches and Parks. Verá que estamos en formato de seminario web en la plataforma Zoom. Esto significa que los iconos en la parte inferior pueden ser un poco diferentes de lo que normalmente ve. El contenido de hoy se transmite en vivo simultáneamente en español, y ahora yo, la intérprete Mercedes Marló, voy a estar traduciendo e interpretando en el canal en español.
Every slide has yellow text to match the English version of content.
Cada diapositiva tiene texto amarillo para que coincida con la versión en inglés del contenido.
And should you need interpretation services, please click on the globe icon and select Spanish.
Si necesita servicios de interpretación al español, por favor haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y seleccione español.
Should you need assistance with closed captioning, that is offered as well. Simply click the Show Captions icon. During today's presentation, we will be accepting questions via the Q&A icon. If you click it, you have the option to ask a question by typing into the box and then selecting to be anonymous or not, and clicking the send arrow on the bottom right. Finally, limited interactions will occur during the Zoom in chat, as it is only being used to pass information on to our participants. If you need to send something to us, click on the chat icon and type your message. Then click send. And again, please direct all questions to the panelists through the Q&A feature. Today's event is being recorded and posted to the Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks YouTube channel. If you miss any portion, need to see something again, or registered but couldn't make it, this entire workshop will be available online. And now that we have the basics out of the way, let me acknowledge that the state of California exists on occupied territory of over 110 federally recognized and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. These lands have been stewarded by Native nations since time immemorial. These lands and waters have significance to the indigenous people of California. Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks work is focused on the ancestral homelands of the Ahachiman, Juanino, and Tongva Gabrielino people. We pay respect to these indigenous people whose land was forcibly colonized and recognize the importance of the tribal relationship to the land, past, present, and future. Today's workshop is brought to you by the nonprofit Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks, or FHBP for short, and we work to protect the natural lands and waterways as well as beaches of Orange County, California. And we are grateful for the grant funding that allows these workshops to be made available. The FHBP team working on this webinar includes myself as the panel moderator. We also have Mercedes Merlot, our interpreter, and Giovanni DeFranco, who's staffing the chat and Q&A. This series is in partnership with the Power in Nature Coalition, which coordinates the grassroots effort for 30 by 30. And if you've not heard of 30 by 30, this initiative, let me give you a little primer. Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N82-20, which sets a goal to protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030, and it's shortened to 30 by 30. It isn't just a California effort, it is a local, state, national, and international effort, and the agency responsible for overseeing implementation of 30 by 30 is the California Natural Resources Agency, or CNRA. There are 3 pillars to 30 by 30, which include biodiversity, access to nature, and climate resilience. CNRA released on Earth Day, April 22nd of last year, a document called Pathways to 30 by 30, which identified 10 different strategies on how we will achieve 30 by 30. And today we're covering 2 of them. First is pathway number 7, which focuses on coordinating with tribal governments. And second is pathway number 4, which features protecting California's coast and marine resources. We're grateful to have with us today experts in their field focusing on this important material. First in our presentation lineup is Deputy Secretary of Tribal Affairs, Geneva E.B. Thompson. She joined the California Natural Resources Agency in June of 2021 as Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs. In this role, Geneva cultivates and ensures the participation and inclusion of tribal governments and communities within the work of CNRA. Recently, Ms. Thompson served as Associate General Counsel for the Yurok tribe, where she practiced environmental and cultural resource law and represented the Yurok tribe in tribal, state, and federal forums. And the second presenter is Sandy Aylesworth from the nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. Sandy advocates to combat illegal fishing for responsible offshore wind development. And prior to joining NRDC, she worked at the U.S. Department of State and was a Marine Policy Fellow at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Legislative and Intergovernmental Affairs. Her first career, though, was as a captain and mate, where she became familiar with oceans on voyages in French Polynesia, Baja, and the United States and Caribbean. Great backgrounds. So first up in our presentation is Geneva, and I will pass this over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and Oseo, everyone. As introduced, my name is Geneva E.B. Thompson. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, she, her pronouns, and very honored to serve as the first ever Deputy Secretary for Tribal Affairs at the California Natural Resources Agency. And just a huge appreciation and thank you to Friends of Harbors, Beaches, and Parks for having me here today to discuss Pathway 7 of how to strengthen partnerships with California Native American tribes in our Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. So I'm excited for the opportunity to share a bit about what we're doing here at the agency. I apologize, I don't see the screen share button.
Let me do it again. There, it should be available now.
There we go, wonderful. Well, thank you. And so a little bit about the California Natural Resources Agency. We're one of a handful of agencies here in the state of California, and our purview is to oversee and support more than 26 distinct departments, conservancies, and commissions. Some that folks might be familiar with are state parks, CAL FIRE, Department of Water Resources. We also have conservancies across the state and a number of commissions as well, the Coastal Commission, State Lands Commission, and the like. And so our agency is that executive kind of level agency that then works in collaboration with our 26 departments, conservancies, and commissions. The agency executive team leads the efforts to steward California's natural environment and to work to advance Governor Newsom's key priorities in the environmental and natural resources space. My role at the agency is to think about and look at how our tribal affairs policies work in relation with our environmental and natural resources policies and coordinate across our departments and their tribal affairs work as well, all with the goal of strengthening partnerships with tribes with everything that we do underneath that agency umbrella. The mission of the California Natural Resources Agency is to restore, protect, and manage the state's natural, historical, and cultural resources for current and future generations using creative approaches and solutions based on science, collaboration, and respect for all communities and interests involved. And so we're very excited for the opportunity to advance Governor Newsom's nature-based solutions executive order and the Pathways 30 by 30 strategy with this mission in mind. So before getting into the details of strengthening partnerships with tribes, I always like to start the conversation around understanding the historical context that we are all in, because a lot of the tribal affairs work that we lead and the partnerships that we have with tribes are based off of the histories and the relationships that the state of California and non-tribal entities have with California Native American tribes. And so to kind of start the conversation, it's important to understand that California Native American tribes have been here since time immemorial. They have deep place-based societies that have been here before the creation of the United States, before the creation of the state of California. And these deep place-based societies have governments that are focused around laws and systems for the understanding and community that each tribe has. California Native American tribes, even today, have robust governments, have robust court systems, cultural connection to places, religions, and laws that are integral to their communities and integral to the connection to place and areas. And so it's really important to understand that these are deep place-based societies and governments that have been here way before the state of California has ever been. It's also important to know that tribal lands are across the United States, and every inch of land within the United States is somebody's ancestral lands, is somebody's area that a tribe and a community have a deep connection to and a deep interest in seeing the health and well-being of those lands. And it was only through a series of laws, military campaigns, wars, forced removal that tribes have been disconnected and forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and important places. And that through these actions, these state-sponsored actions, that tribal communities and people were abused, enslaved, and killed throughout the colonization of the state of California and the broader United States. And so these past historical wrongs are still impacting tribes even today. And the ramifications of the harm and abuse that tribes have suffered are at play today and are impacting communities, impacting tribal governments, impacting folks' well-being and connection to land and space. It's also really important to remember that this forced removal of the original stewards of the land also forcibly removed tribal expertise, tribal stewardship that has helped maintain and keep these lands healthy and abundant and thriving for such a long time. And so by removing that tribal expertise, by removing that stewardship, we're also seeing ramifications of that loss of stewardship, that loss of knowledge in the health and well-being of our environment, plants, animals, and species. And that is not only impacting tribal communities, but it's also intensifying the impacts of the climate crisis that we're all feeling today. And so I try to set the stage with understanding that historical context, because that's where we're working today. And we're working to acknowledge, understand, bring to light those historical wrongs, so we can then start to move forward in the spirit of truth and healing and working in collaboration and in partnership with tribes and all of the work that we're doing. And so it's I have here on the screen Governor Newsom's executive order in 1519, which was the governor's official apology to California Native American tribes for those historical wrongs, and then a commitment from the state of California to establish a Truth and Healing Council that would then bring to light those historical wrongs and map out next steps for truth and healing. And so I would like to share this executive order because I think it does a really good job of understanding and highlighting the past wrongs, and then how we're looking at implementing our tribal affairs policies and moving forward across all of the work that we're doing here at the agency. And so if you haven't had the opportunity to review Executive Order in 1519 or Governor Newsom's apology, I really encourage you taking a look at that, because I think it does a really good job of highlighting the issues and showing a path forward on how we're working to analyze and shift some of the state policies that we have here today. Two other key Governor Newsom policies that I like to highlight, and when talking about strengthening partnerships with tribes in the 30 by 30 context, the first one being the Statement of Administrative Policy on Native American Ancestral Lands. And in that policy, Governor Newsom directed our departments and our agencies to identify opportunities to increase tribal access and co-management of public lands and natural resources, and then also identify opportunities for ancestral land return. And then the second policy is the Executive Order N8220, which is the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, which I know have already been discussed earlier in this presentation. But the idea, or the directive from the Executive Order, is to develop strategic policies and goals to elevate the role of natural and working lands in the fight against climate change and advancing biodiversity conservation. So out of the Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, the California Natural Resources Agency had developed two strategies to basically map out how the state is going to implement the executive order. And so the first one is the Natural and Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy, which describes and prioritizes management practices of 8 landscapes to deliver on our climate change goals and advance broader environmental, economic, and social objectives. And then the second one is the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy, which we're all here to discuss today, which identifies 10 pathways to conserve 30% of lands in coastal waters by 2030. Really encourage folks to take a look at both of these strategies. There's a wealth of knowledge in them, and both can be found on our website, californianature.ca.gov. So the conservation framework that is laid out in the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy have 3 key objectives and 3 core commitments. And I like to highlight these key objectives and core commitments because they work with each other as we advance our conservation goals under the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. So the 3 key objectives are to protect and restore biodiversity, expand access to nature, and mitigate and build resiliency to the climate change. And then the core commitments are to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, strengthen tribal partnerships, and protect our economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and food supply. So I really encourage folks, as you are thinking about working to advance the 30 by 30 goal, thinking about your programs, your initiatives that you're leading in your space, to think about these core commitments as like a lens to apply to each project that you are considering. How is your project advancing justice? How is your project strengthening partnerships with tribes? How is it protecting economic prosperity, clean energy resources, and food supply? And if you kind of keep those core commitments in mind as you're putting together projects or initiatives under the 30 by 30, that would fit so beautifully in the conservation framework that's included in the strategy. So you will see in the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy, there is a great kind of graphic included in the strategy that pulls out some key principles for strengthening partnerships with tribes. And I really encourage folks to take a look at that in the strategy. There's some good information about how all of us can shift our programs and our projects with this idea of strengthening tribal partnership. And then I have some examples later in the PowerPoint to show kind of like on the ground, what do we mean when we say strengthening tribal partnerships? But you will see here, I like to have like 5 kind of key areas that I think about when we're looking to advance stronger partnerships with tribes. So the first one is support and share decision-making with California Native American tribes in the work. So if you are a state or local government, that can be through consultation, early, often, and meaningful tribal consultation. If you are a non-governmental entity, that is working to collaboratively build something with your partners on the tribe and with tribal partners. Another strategy in strengthening partnerships with tribes is actually integrating tribal priorities into the work that you're doing. So after you built the relationship, after you've had those conversations and are collaboratively building something together, ensure that tribe's priorities are built into the framework of whatever project that you're advancing. Then the third one is funding those tribal priorities, working closely with tribes to apply for those grant funds or ensure that they are part of the project and can have their time reimbursed, or finding other ways to support tribal priorities through that funding and capacity building piece. And then the last two areas that we are really focused on here at the California Natural Resources Agency and in partnering with tribes is increasing tribal access and co-management to lands, ensuring that tribal members have access to their sacred sites, ensuring tribal members have access to their culturally significant species, and ensuring tribal governments are at the table and having those shared decision-making opportunities on the management of these areas. And then last but not least is identifying opportunities for ancestral land return. If the goal is to put land back into tribal expertise and tribal stewardship, the best way to do that is land return and having the tribes be the owners and the managers of those lands. And that's something that you'll see kind of throughout the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy is encouraging and supporting ancestral land return in this space. So for the rest of the for the rest of the PowerPoint presentation, I'm trying to pull out some examples of what we are doing here at the agency in advancing stronger partnerships with tribes in the 30 by 30 space. And so the first one I'm very excited to share with folks is our brand new grant program, the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Program, which has $101 million to support tribally led tribal priorities in the nature-based solution space. So this grant program was informed by consultation with tribes. We had many roundtable sessions, and I had the honor of traveling across the state to have regional workshops with tribal leaders in the development of this grant program. And the idea for these funds are to advance tribal multi-benefit nature-based solutions. We have our first deadline in the grant program is August 28th, and then our second deadline is September 29th. And so if you're working collaboratively with a tribal partner, please share this grant opportunity with them because there's exciting resources available to support ancestral land return, to support conservation and restoration projects, and natural working lands, kind of climate smart projects as well. So really encourage folks to take a look at this grant opportunity. So some examples of how to actually on the ground partner with tribes. One example that I'm highlighting here today is actually establishing contracts with tribes and having tribes be your subcontractors or having tribes be the lead contractor in a restoration project or in another type of project that your department or organization is leading. And so the example that I have here is the Yurok Tribe Construction Corporation has a contract with a few of our departments in the restoration of Prairie Creek floodplain. And so we're having Yurok people, tribally led entity, actually be the contractor who's doing that restoration work and having the original stewards of the land on the land doing that work, and then also having economic benefit opportunity as well. And so that's one example of how to support tribes in this restoration work. Is really just saying, hey, we'll pay you to do the work because you have the expertise. We'd love to do that. We'd love to work with you. So that's one example of how to partner with tribes. The next example is there's a couple options in thinking about ancestral land return and different kind of mechanisms and spaces and been able to do that. And so the example here for ancestral land return is to work collaboratively with tribes in the direct purchase of property. So one example I'm excited to share is the Ocean Protection Council provided a Proposition 1 grant to support the Wiyot tribes reacquiring 46 acres of undeveloped coastal wetlands and uplands near Weegi Bay or Humboldt Bay. And so through the grant program, through partnerships with Cal Poly Humboldt, Humboldt Bay Keepers, Friends of the Dunes, this collaborative partnership was able to acquire funds through a grant program and then actually just directly purchase the land for the Wiyot tribe's ownership and management. So more information can be found on the website link on the bottom of the webpage if you're interested in learning more about this exciting ancestral land return example. Another opportunity is transfer of ownership. And so if your entity is managing conserved lands and wants to support a tribe in their ancestral land return priorities or goals, encourage looking at what that transfer of ownership might look like. So the example that we have here is Butte Creek Ecological Preserve was just directly transferred. 93 acres of preserved lands were directly returned to the Mechooptah Indian tribe of Chico Rancheria from Chico State Enterprises. And this was an example of Chico State Enterprises had purchased these lands, had been conserving and stewarding them, and then in partnership with the tribe, thought it would make sense to have these lands returned back to them. Another example is using mitigation as an opportunity to support ancestral land return. And the example I have here is the 40 acres that were returned to the Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone Reservation. And this was through a Caltrans highway expansion project and the identification that there would be irreparable harms of cultural resources in the expansion of that highway. And the lead agency, which is the State Lands Commission, determined that as a mitigation to those harms to cultural resources, Caltrans was to purchase these 40 acres and then return them to the tribe. So the cultural resources within those 40 acres would be managed and conserved by the tribe as a mitigation measure. Another example is an act through Congress. So Congress has the authority to return federal-owned land to California Native American tribes, or tribes generally. The Karuk tribe, in partnership with Congressman Huffman and Senator Padilla, were able to recently go through that congressional process and having ancestral land return through that process. Another example of supporting co-management and access is through the development of conservation easements, and just highlighting here that tribes can be owners and managers of conservation easements. And so by having the tribe own and manage and utilize conservation easements on lands is another way to ensure that that expertise and that access to lands are held and supported by tribes. And so I pulled out the code section here to show kind of like the tribal space in conservation easements, and for folks' consideration as you're thinking about supporting co-management and tribal access. And I know I'm getting close to time, so I apologize for going a little bit quick here, but wanted to highlight another tool in the toolbox for partnering with tribes is developing access agreements. And the example that we have here is an MOU between state parks and the Yurok tribe to facilitate Yurok members' access to the North Coast Redwoods District state parks with tribal IDs for the purposes of collecting plant and minerals for traditional purposes in lieu of a permit. So that's reducing barriers tribal members have in accessing state parks for their for cultural purposes and access to their sacred places, their important places that are in the park system. Another example, another tool in the toolbox is entering into joint powers agreements. And the example we have here is between the Yurok tribe and state parks. They have a JPA for the management of Chapek Stone Lagoons Visitor Center. And this is the first tribally operated visitor center within a state park system. And the tribe, through this JPA, is leading and doing the work at the visitor center, sharing their culture, their history, their way, right? And that is in partnership with state parks. And with that, those are my examples of how we are working towards strengthening partnerships with tribes. I hope you found it helpful and maybe spark some ideas for your own work. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions. So Wado, and thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much. I think that context you provided at the beginning was incredibly valuable and important for all of us to hear. But the examples, I'm hoping, are relevant to the folks that are participating and those that may be watching afterwards. So thank you. We do have some questions. One question from Pamela, and I think this may be something that other areas are currently navigating as well. So when you have a jurisdiction that has multiple tribes, federally recognized and not federally recognized, how do you proceed?
Yes, so the best way to proceed is to strive towards collaboration, strive towards jointly problem solving, jointly working together with tribal leaders from all the different tribes that have ancestral ties to the area that you're looking at. And that takes a variety of different forms and be able to do that. And so we've seen in the past where tribes with shared territories have come together to identify how they want to work together in a space, how they're going to co-manage with each other and collaborate with each other. When those situations happen, it can be a really beautiful thing. And so I wouldn't shy away from having conversations with the goal of collaboration. And the best thing you can do is connect and talk with all of the tribes and try to find a way to reach that collaboration. An example, I think it's a pretty public example of having multiple tribes kind of co-manage or work collaboratively for the protection of a space is the Bears Ears National Monument. They have a lot of documents and a lot of information about how the 5 tribes have come together to protect this important place. And so if you're looking for something to kind of think about and read and have an example, I encourage taking a peek at the Bears Ears National Monument governance structure.
Yep, that is a great example. I've read some books on that one. I appreciate that. Another question, and this is from Virginia. Is the state incorporating funding for management and stewardship in addition to funding for acquisition? And there's a follow-up. Are they doing endowments, or are there mechanisms for grants for these purposes that enable very long-term stewardship, so 20+ years?
Yes. So the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Grant Program is available for acquiring property, but it's also has a planning component and an implementation component, and management, stewardship, and planning can be components of tribes applications and accessing these funds. And so that's one, bucket of, financial support in that space. But basically the hope is, that the goal is by having strengthening tribal partnerships as a core commitment in the Pathways to 30x30 strategy, as well as the Natural Working Lands Climate Smart strategy, that all of the nature-based solution money that the state has and is granting should be looking at and supporting tribes in this space. And so while we're excited that we have $101 million just for tribes, that's not the only pool of funding available. Tribes are eligible applicants for nature-based solutions funding across the state. And so the hope is to have those funds available for tribes in the management and stewardship of their spaces.
Thank you. Another question, this one from Barbara, and I'll encourage everyone, keep dropping your questions in the Q&A. We'll, if we don't get to them now, we'll have time at the end. I do see one in the chat. So Kent, I think that's from you. If you're able to move that into the Q&A, I'd appreciate it. The question from Barbara is, my understanding is that conservation easements must be held by an outside agency, not in-house. How does that work for a tribe?
Yeah, so the conservation easement was if a particular person or entity owns the land that the tribe would then own the conservation easement on that land, and then have the protection, the stewardship, the access to those lands for those important places. So there are some lands that ancestral land return might not be an option at this time. And so having a conservation easement that the tribe owns and operates is a mechanism, a tool in the toolbox to ensure that tribes and tribal members have access to their culturally important spaces. So under the law, it's called a conservation easement, but it's kind of in casual conversation, they can also be called cultural easements. And so folks are familiar with cultural easements. It's utilizing the same statute.
Great, thank you so much, Geneva. I think we'll go ahead and move over to Sandy's presentation. So Sandy, you're going to talk to us about pathway number 4. And while it does include a little bit more than just the marine environment, I know that your background is extensive and can cover quite a bit of territory at the interface between the land and the water. So I'll go ahead and let you go ahead and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and Geneva. Thank you so much for that presentation. I learned a ton, super illuminating. So I wrote down some ideas, and it was amazing to learn how many opportunities there are to strengthen tribal partnerships through 30 by 30. As Melanie said, I will be talking about the pathway number 4, which is about protecting 30% of oceans and coasts by 2030. And I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about myself, even though I know that Melanie has given you my bio. And I think it's because hopefully it will help us all sort of remember why it is that we're here working hard to protect more of our oceans and coasts. So as Melanie said, I direct NRDC's Pacific Initiative within NRDC's Oceans Program. And I came to that work through working as a sailor. So I worked for many years on large sailing vessels, and I worked in Antarctica on research cruises. And of that 10-year career that I had kind of on the water, both in coastal waters, but also out kind of in the middle of the ocean, I spent the bulk of that time working with students, both from sort of school age California kids, all the way up to college age kids doing ocean voyages. And the salient piece that I really bring with me to my policy work is that it was just so energizing and striking time and time again to kind of see how much the love and wonder of the ocean is universal. I think in the hundreds of students that I worked with over the years, I don't maybe remember like 2 that hated the ocean. So it is a marvel for all to enjoy. And that's something that we really see in the numbers, if we're able to kind of try to quantify sort of the importance of the California coast. By the way, I'm just giving some background before I dive into what the state and NRDC is doing in terms of implementing pathway number 4. So just sort of connecting to kind of the enjoyment of the ocean, there is, it's sort of hard to quantify. A lot of the sort of ocean use data that we have for California is older, but it still is really instructive. And so I just wanted to share some, I think, kind of stunning stats about the way that Californians feel about their oceans and why this pillar of carrying out 30 by 30 for the oceans is so important to all of us and why we're working hard on it. The first is just that there are, and this data is about 10 years old, but Californians from inland, like far inland, all the way, up and down the state, make about 109 million annual trips to the ocean every year. And something amazing to me about those visits to the coast is that the vast majority of people are going to do recreation and what we call non-consumptive activities like bird watching and beach walks. And one really kind of fun stunning thing that I found is a lot of people that come to the coast like to pull off and just like admire it from their car. And if you were to quantify some of this in terms of the economic contribution that it makes to California, California has about a 45 billion ocean economy, and well over half of that is through tourism and recreation. And something that I think is really important about the tourism and recreation piece is that it's a real job driver, a real economic engine for the state. That sector supports 446,000 jobs. So pretty impressive. And so when we sort of think about how we can implement 30 by 30 in California, I think something NRDC has been really focused on, and something that's clearly very important to the state and reflected in the executive order, is just about kind of enhancing the quality of the experience and expanding access to these non-consumptive uses, while also being able to provide support for the economy. In terms of, oops, sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. There we go. And then in terms of marine life, I think given who the audience is here, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this, but as you all know, California's incredibly unique and spectacular biodiversity extends, of course, to its oceans and coasts. And the flora and fauna of California love California's ocean as well. We are known for having what's called a large marine ecosystem. The California Current has a unique feature of bringing this very cold, nutrient-rich water and creating seasonal upwelling, which is a huge driver of California's biodiversity. And so we're home to endangered whales and sea otters and majestic kelp forests. And all of this richness really supports not only kind of our spiritual connection to the water, but also, as I said previously, is a driver for commercial fisheries and the tourism and recreation industries. Moving on to how the state is thinking about what's already conserved in terms of our oceans and coasts, I'm going to I'll share that the state has determined that 16% of California's state waters are conserved already, which is pretty good. It's a little over half. And the sort of the mechanism for protection there is what's called a marine protected area. And the state has an extensive network of 124 marine protected areas. So what that means, and I'll talk a bit about those in a moment, what that means is that we need to protect an additional 14% or 500,000 acres by 2030. And I guess in terms of thinking about the task ahead, I'm going to provide just a bit of historic context on the creation of the state's MPA network, just because I think that gives, I think that helps convey sort of the challenge before us, but also the opportunity. So let's see, taking a step back, in 1999, many moons ago, the California state legislature passed what's called the Marine Life Protection Act. And that act said that the state has a handful of marine protected areas. And a way to think about marine protected areas is that they are kind of like parks in the ocean. And they are often ideally located in sort of a biodiversity hotspot where there is a habitat and sort of unique features of that part of the ocean or coast that you want to protect and remove stressors. So the state said California already has a handful of marine protected areas, and what we really need is more of a scientific approach to selecting these areas, and we need to work hard to protect an entire range of habitats along the California coast. And we need to do it in a way that is scientific and deliberate rather than sort of local spots cropping up in an ad hoc manner. And so the legislature passed what's called the Marine Life Protection Act, and that provided the mechanism to design an entire network of marine protected areas in California. This was a globally significant undertaking. It still is incredibly impressive. The process took over a decade and was quite fraught and contentious. I was not part of it, but when you talk to people that were active in it, it was both sort of, for many people, one of the most fulfilling and demanding parts of their career, and also very fraught and complex. And there were mistakes that were made. For instance, tribal input was not fully integrated, and there's a lot of residual, I think, pain and I guess understanding that process could have been much, much better, for instance. And so in the end, though, I will say, for its flaws and its omissions and the difficulty of it, the state did get 124 marine protected areas. So looking forward, CNRA has said all of those count toward the state's 30 by 30 goal. So if we need an additional 14%, the state has said they're not all going to be in marine protected areas. There are other mechanisms that we have. But I just wanted to offer sort of the context for sort of how demanding it can be to establish a marine protected area in, I would say, any waters and certainly California's. So as we think about implementing 30 by 30 for the ocean in California, we want to think about the major threats to biodiversity that we're facing and think about how do we reduce those and what sort of regulations and restrictions do we want to restrict so that these discrete habitats have the opportunity to thrive. Our senior scientist on the ocean team sort of quite regularly does kind of a landscape analysis of the science showing what the major threats to ocean biodiversity are. And for the past many years, we are seeing sort of in order of ranking that the major threats to ocean biodiversity are overfishing first. Second is habitat loss. So that would be through activities like oil and gas drilling or extensive dredging, and maybe even thinking about future threats, sort of the extensive cabling associated with floating offshore wind development. And then global change. So there we're talking about impacts of climate change like ocean acidification and warming, and pollution. Pollution includes things like nutrient runoff, very sedimented water that would interfere with water quality, and also, of course, ocean plastic. And in terms of just building on this idea, as we think about 30 by 30 in California, there are some sort of concepts that we want to build in. I just talked about threats that we want to remove. And then we also think about kind of the area of protection, because we know that size matters in terms of the biodiversity benefits you're going to get in the ocean. We also, I've already alluded to this, but one of the really groundbreaking elements of the California MP network is that they really strove to have habitat representativity. So we want to get a variety of California's coastal ecosystems, sandy bottom, kelp forests, rocky, intertidal, et cetera. And then connectivity, we know, is really important so that you can have things like larval dispersal, so that you could have a fish spawn one place and then have that larva be carried to another area where there also are fewer stressors, so that larva has an opportunity to mature. And also that facilitates the transfer of genetic biodiversity, and species movement is going to be really important as waters warm, for instance. And then another thing, or another, I guess, element of this that is critical here is, and really reflected in the executive order, which we're pleased about, is that this time when we embark on new ocean protections, we really have an opportunity to expand access for communities that have been marginalized and either come to the coast and don't feel comfortable being there because of the way that people interact with them, or sort of the culture around certain types of recreation, for instance, where they're not welcoming. And we also have an opportunity to enhance tribal stewardship of marine spaces. So at long last, here are, so within this pathway, the Ocean Protection Council has articulated 4, I'm calling them pathways here, but I guess we could also say strategies to get to that other 500,000 acres of ocean protection that's needed. So the first one is adaptive management of the California MPA network, and I'll talk more about that. I know that one is a real mouthful. The second one is to build protections in existing national marine sanctuaries. The third is indigenous marine stewardship areas. And the fourth is other effective area-based conservation measures, also a real mouthful. I'm going to spend just a moment to talk about the last two. I know I'm going sort of out of order. But on the indigenous marine stewardship areas, I would say that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity to restore tribal management to coastal waters and open up waters to traditional harvesting practices, and kind of restore a cultural connection that tribes have to stewarding coastal resources. There are some efforts underway that are in formation. Geneva's far more expert in what the state is working on. With that regard, I know that there are a variety of efforts within the NGO community, the environmental NGO community, to help connect, or to work on building connections with tribes so that we can begin to identify areas that would be sort of viable candidates for tribal marine stewardship areas. On number 4, other effective area-based conservation measures. This is an interesting one because it refers to what people also often say, sort of colloquially, is a sort of a de facto marine protected area. There are areas of the ocean where there are not a great deal of ocean uses occurring. So, for example, outside of Vandenberg Air Force Base, the public is not allowed to, or a lot of activities are restricted in that area. And so you might take a place that already has sort of restrictions on its use and say that's sort of equivalent to a marine protected area. And so something like that could count. What the state is doing right now is doing kind of an accounting exercise of where are these places and what sort of restrictions are there on fishing use, and are there ways to make those protections more durable. So for instance, if there is an area where there are certain types of fishing gear restricted, but that area or those restrictions are set to sunset after 10 years, could you extend them and then layer on additional protections? So that accounting is beginning, and I believe that Ocean Protection Council has assembled kind of a suite of scientists to help guide on number 4. Melody, would you mind telling me where I'm at time-wise?
You have 4 minutes.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So a couple of key concepts before I talk about The first two pathways is that in order for marine biodiversity protections to work, you have to kind of reduce certain stressors. And so you're going to get different outcomes depending on what level of protection you have given. And this is really fundamental to a lot of NRDC's advocacy around 30 by 30. There are ways where you can do sort of more lenient restrictions, but you're going to get a less desirable outcome from a biodiversity perspective. In recent years, I actually am spacing on the year that the article came out, but there was MPA scientists from around the world got together and examined the MPA literature and created kind of a framework or taxonomy of kind of expected outcomes when you restrict certain activities. And they created what's called the Marine Protected Area Guide. And I love this graphic, and I hope you can see it okay. But this sort of depicts kind of outcomes that you could expect depending on how strong your level of protection is. So there's the fully protected areas and highly protected areas, which is what NRDC advocates for, because you can see from the picture, this is when you kind of get the most biological richness. And you see with MPAs or the equivalent that are highly or fully protected, that you can kind of reliably see bigger fish, more predatory fish, greater species diversity, better protection of habitat, versus when you have more lenient restrictions, MPAs are lightly protected or minimally protected, you're just going to get a less biological richness. And in terms of activities that we're talking about restricting and the various level of protection, this is a great graphic, but I'm not going to spend much time on it because I don't have much time left. But the major activities that you're looking at restricting are mining, dredging and dumping, anchoring, building infrastructure, and restricting fishing, and then also non-extractive activities. Okay, so on the adaptive management, so this is number one of the marine strategies. Right now, this is kind of fortuitous timing in terms of the state's 30 by 30 initiative. California's MPA network is going through its first decade-old management review. And so we're taking stock of how the MPAs have done over the past 10 years at the Fish and Game Commission, with a lot of support from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the state is in the process of adaptively managing the MPA network. So this is one of the ways that through this process, we could see strengthened protections for certain marine protected areas. And there's also the potential to submit petitions for new marine protected areas. So this is a huge opportunity for the public. And kind of my major takeaway is that if there are candidate areas that you see as deserving of additional protections, this is our moment to really sort of make the case for them at the Fish and Game Commission. The first round of petitions will be accepted most likely November 30th in preparation for the December Fish and Game Commission meeting. So that's an exciting opportunity. That's the decadal management review. And then another element of California 30 by 30 for the oceans that we are working hard on is this piece about strengthening national marine sanctuaries. National marine sanctuaries have been determined under the MPA guide as being minimally protected, meaning there's a huge opportunity to boost the level of protection in national marine sanctuaries. And that is something the state has recognized and is in the process of evaluating the level of protections within California, national marine sanctuaries and state waters, and looking at what additional protections we could add on to help bring the level of protection that the sanctuaries afford up. And that I'm really excited to hear your questions, and thank you so much for your attention. And my email is at the bottom in case you'd like to email me with great ideas for candidate areas for additional protections. Thank you.
My screen was having some issues, so I apologize. I'll go back to sharing, maybe. All right, Sandy, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Part of the reason I chose to have the focus on this particular strategy was because we don't often hear enough about, as my friends at CNRA call it, the salty side of 30 by 30. And so I learned a lot, and I appreciate that. I do want to encourage folks to put their questions in the Q&A. A couple of things have popped up, though, that I think would be important for context. So I heard you describe a federal level of protection and a state level of protection. And it sounds like the federal level is not as conservation focused maybe or strong as the state level. Is that an accurate read?
Thanks for that. Yes, this is a place where we're really counting on California leadership. I'm sure the lands folks feel this way too, but I would say, especially in the context of the way 30 by 30 is implemented for the ocean, one of the concerns that we have in terms of our national America the Beautiful initiative is that while the US actually has about 24% of its waters protected in highly and fully protected MPAs, the vast majority are in the Pacific. So we'd really like to see greater representativity on both the East and West Coast of the US. And so this is a place where we really would love to see California set an example of, how you can enact kind of highly and fully protected or the equivalent areas for ocean and coastal protection.
And I'm curious about California. So being a coastal state is a unique attribute, but how did California do in terms of where it landed in the timeline of setting up marine protected areas? Do you know that?
A great question. If I were to hazard a guess, but maybe take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I really think California's MPA network is one of two actual networks in the entire world. So Australia has the other one, and then we're in the process of having having it placed on the IUCN Green List. So it really is this iconic achievement. And so I guess I feel a little intimidated by having 500,000 acres left to go, given that it took, if we really want to kind of ambitiously implement California 30 by 30 for the oceans, it's hard to sort of generate the community support that's needed. And it's also really hard to, identify candidate areas, but there are exciting opportunities. And it's a time-consuming process, but also something that California has done and been a global leader in. So I am really hopeful that it's something we can do again. Excellent. So I would say California is doing pretty well. And then in terms of where California could go, I was at the Convention on Biodiversity Conference of the Parties in Montreal with Secretary Crowfoot and team. There was like a huge California delegation, and California joined the Subnational High Ambition Coalition. And so I think, just to reiterate this point, it is hard to get strong protections in the ocean. And this is a place where, if California is going to live up to that high ambition, goal and aspiration that it has, where there's going to be some hard work to do, but it's happened before, and I'm hopeful that we can do it again.
Excellent, thank you. So following up though on communities getting involved, there is this opportunity right now. Can you tell us kind of how folks could get involved with this decadal review that's going on and the time frame for such activities?
Yes, there is. So thanks to the Marine Life Protection Act, there is this established process at the Fish and Game Commission where members of the public can submit a petition that says, hey, we'd like to see these tweaks to an existing MPA. Like maybe here's a boundary that needs to change to help with enforcement. Or you could say, we would like to have a new marine protected area and make a case for it. The Fish and Game Commission met yesterday and decided that they're going to accept petitions, kind of the first round of petitions for the adaptive management process. Sorry, I know this is like very wonky, but sort of connecting back to the fact that the state just did this big review of its existing MPA network and found like, hey, MPAs really work. They had a bunch of benefits. I can talk about that later. As part of the adaptive management process, they're accepting petitions and going to sort of kick off the review of those by November 30th. So there will be opportunities after that, but this is kind of the first one, and they're pretty excited about it. And they have solicited quite a bit of public input on what sort of criteria or the lens through which they should look at petitions is, and they're good. They talk about enhancing equity. They talk about improving enforcement. They talk about building climate resilience. And so I guess in terms of getting involved in that process, I think an easy thing to do is to look at the Fish and Game Commission website. There's a decadal management review tab, or just email me, and I'm really happy to get people involved. I would say NRDC is working hard in concert with a number of other NGOs to try to identify candidate areas, but it's a huge state. So it would be really, really welcome to have involvement from groups sort of far beyond the existing coalition.
Great, thank you. I do want to go over to Barbara's question in the Q&A. The question is, where do estuaries figure in the coastal framework? And then maybe I'll pause there so you don't have to remember all of the question pieces.
That's a wonderful question. And I think that estuaries are, I'm going to give you kind of a mealy-mouthed answer here, Barbara. I think there are areas where estuaries could be candidates for additional protection. There are also places where estuaries are managed under a different framework than the state MPA network. So they could be sort of reclassified to count. And I would also add that estuaries are, of course, critically important in terms of adaptation to sea level rise and improving water quality. So that wasn't a fabulous answer, but I guess I would say estuaries are very important in this coastal piece of it, and certainly count toward, like certain they would count toward 30 by 30 if they were afforded protections.
Okay, so I think that answers the second question, which was, are they covered in oceans 30%? And the last piece is, what is their level of protection and what are the challenges involved with protection?
I would say the level of protections for the estuaries, so there are a few within the state MPA network, but they really vary in terms of level of protection. And so there are places where it would be great to strengthen the level of protection within certain estuaries. And then, sorry, I forgot the other part of the question.
Challenges involved with protection.
Challenges involved, in protecting the estuaries? Yes, I would say, I think there are, okay, so for instance, our team was just looking at it was actually a lagoon, but estuaries have kind of, they're heavily used. And so there are issues like dredging, I would say a fair number of water quality issues, and kind of outflow from inland issues in terms of estuary protection. And then there's erosion and sea level rise and invasive species. And so they are like, for how critically important they are, they're sort of, I would guess, probably one of the most impacted types of habitat. So that's something, I would say estuary specifically is something that Surfrider has been really focused on and considering. And I would say there's opportunity, but the challenges of protection are somewhat extensive. Competing uses, lots of state agencies competing, and then kind of the environmental threats that they face that are unique to estuaries.
Great, thank you for that. So I think I'm going to wrap up the slide so that I can get rid of the share screen, and then we'll go to the rest of the questions that are in the Q&A box, and I'll allow folks the time to add additional questions for both of our speakers. So this is the 5th workshop in an 8-part series of webinars, and it's the 4th Thursday of every month from 10 to 11:30. With the exception of November, it'll be the 5th Thursday. And again, we're featuring content related to 30 by 30, helping you and your organization achieve your goals in alignment with the state's efforts. So our next workshop is September 28th, which focuses on 3 pathways to 30 by 30, which is number 1, regionally led conservation, number 3, conservation easements. And we're actually going to do number 4 again, but it's going to be a different perspective. It's going to be from the Ocean Protection Council, and they're also going to outline funding opportunities. And we all love talking about money. So if you're able to take out your phone, you can go ahead and scan the QR code with your camera, click on the link to register for the next event. The speakers will actually be from the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, the Eastern Sierra Land Trust, and as I mentioned, the Ocean Protection Council. So we hope to see you there. Of course, if you want to be notified about our workshops, you have the option to be added to our email list, or you can email us at community@fhbp.org, and that gives us the express permission to add you to our email list. I do want to encourage you to get yourself added to the state's 30 by 30 update list. So this is the link that you can use to get into that update subscription page. And this will keep you informed about CNRA grants, programs, speakers, webinars, public comment opportunities, all sorts of great content. So I want to thank both Geneva and Sandy for their time, and we appreciate the experience that you're bringing to the table, the knowledge that you've accumulated over your years of hard work, and your extensive backgrounds, which led to fantastic presentations. So at the end of this entire webinar, you will be taken to a survey, and if by chance it doesn't show up because Zoom is deciding to be finicky, it will be emailed out tomorrow as well. So I'm going to stop the share screen and we'll move directly over to our questions. Let's see. All right. So one question directly for Geneva is, does CNRA deliberately employ Native Americans to assist with these tribal-based solution efforts?
Yeah, so, across all of our agencies and departments, we are working very hard to adjust and hiring practices and sharing information about job opportunities, really with the goal of having a workforce that reflects the beauty and diversity of the state of California. And so really encourage folks who, if you are a member of a tribe and you are interested in a position here in the state of California, there are many job opportunities that are available, and encourage folks to take a look at calcareers.ca.gov, and there's a great search function so you can look up all the job opportunities that are available across the state of California. We also just recently did a job hiring webinar that will be posted on our website here soon, that just, shares some tips and strategies of how to apply for and receive a state job. And so if folks are interested in that, please do that. Also very happy to come talk with communities, come talk to colleges, just to share information about all the employment opportunities that we have available in state government. So that invite is out there. Please let me know if I can come share any of the opportunities that we have for employment with any of your communities. We also are working really hard to create different advisory committees or different spaces for representatives of tribes to serve, to be able to shape state policy. And so across our departments, there's a good number of advisory councils that have been established for opportunity to do that deep dive into these policies, to ensure that the experts that are at tribes and representing tribes have the space to work collaboratively with policymakers on the various things that are coming out of the agency. And so if there's a particular area that you're interested in and you would like to serve in that capacity, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be very happy to connect you to the appropriate department or the appropriate policy lead who is working on a wide variety of policies across the state. And then for specifically the Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Grant Program, we are seeking nominations right now to serve on the grant review panel. And we're looking for experts that have traditional ecological knowledge, cultural, tribal law and policy. I know I'm missing a bunch. I'm sorry, I should have my notes right in front of me, but there's a big list of expertise that we're looking for, and we're asking for nominations for people to serve in that capacity to help us review all of the great applications that are coming in for the $101 million Tribal Nature-Based Solutions Grant Program. And that nomination form is due September 1st. So if yourself or you have someone in mind that you think would be great to serve in that capacity, please nominate yourself or that person, because we'd love to have you all join us.
Great, thank you for that information. I'll move over to Sandy on a question back to the MPAs. Are there geographies that you and your team have identified as being critical to incorporate in the MPA that maybe if folks in those locations are listening right now would like to know about?
Yeah, great question. There are some places where there were gaps, where there are like long stretches of where, for a variety of reasons that are very complex and historic that I don't know all of, there is kind of an ecological connectivity gap. And so there are some areas in Southern California that we're considering for, possible candidates for additional protection. So there's kind of the ecological connectivity gaps that I think are really prime opportunities. And now that I'm on the spot, I am spacing the exact area. But I would say it's somewhere around the Carpinteria area. And then there are also places where we see opportunities to sort of build in increased access for marginalized communities that were not necessarily included in sort of the first round. And so I think LA Long Beach area could benefit from some additional protections. And then I know I'm really focused on Southern California here, but there are also habitat representativity gaps and areas to think about in terms of where fish and invertebrates might be migrating as waters get warmer and more acidic. And so one habitat I know where there's not necessarily, even this is sort of irrespective of climate change, but there are not quite as many sandy habitats that are protected. And then in terms of building in climate resilience, that is an area that the Fish and Game Commission and I know OPC are working really hard to study and sort of assess, like what other ways can we shore up resilience to climate change. And I think that that will include applying science, also conducting research to really see like what other areas need to be protected. It's definitely more complicated than like just bumping protections north, but you know, for instance, that is a pretty active I think area that the state's committed to sort of building out and prioritizing protections for, and certainly a priority of NRDCs.
Excellent. Thank you for that insider tip, I'll call it. Let's head back to Geneva. I do have a question from somebody in the Q&A that's anonymous, but I want to ask a pre-question to it. So the question is about access to the Native American Heritage Commission list. So let's start with, what is the Native American Heritage Commission list?
Sure. Through a variety of different statutes, the legislature has directed the Native American Heritage Commission to maintain a contact list of California Native American tribes for the purposes of cultural affiliation, cultural resource protection, as well as for the implementation for CalNAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, and the return of ancestors, burial, funerary items, as well as cultural resources back to tribes. Really that contact list is utilized for a couple of those statutes. I think the big one that folks are familiar with is the AB 52 that amended the California Environmental Quality Act, requiring lead agencies to consult with California Native American tribes during that environmental review process to understand impacts to tribal cultural resources, natural resources, and to strive towards avoidance of those impacts. And in the event that avoidance isn't a possible alternative, to mitigate impacts to tribal cultural resources. And so that contact list is kind of that first moment of knowing who to connect with, who to start those consultations with, and the CEQA world, in the CalNAGPRA world, in the most likely descendant world. Like there's a couple statutes that clearly articulate the use and need of that contact list.
Great. So now that we understand what the list is and where it comes from and how folks get on it, the comment is, our organization is committed to meaningful consultation with tribal partners. I do want to pause here. Are organizations required to do consultations, or is it really agencies? So the organization can aim to be more inclusive, but an actual tribal consultation, as I understand it, needs to happen between agencies.
Yeah, so consultations are a space for governments to work together to identify solutions, or solutions to a particular problem, or collaboratively work on something together, right? And so consultations are typically government to government. For non-governmental entities, it's still very important to work with your tribal partners. It's very important to create spaces for collaborative relationships, right? Engagement, connection in community. But if you're kind of looking at kind of the strict definition of consultation, it's between two governments.
Okay, I just want to be sensitive to the fact that, you know, a nonprofit or a community-based group, there are specific language I just want to be aware of. And I think tribal consultation the strict definition is between agencies. And so the goal of an organization may be to collaborate. So clarifying that was important. But the question goes into, can CNRA help assist with identifying culturally affiliated Indigenous communities for a landscape or a project area?
I think if there's a project that you all are leading and looking to strengthen your partnerships with tribes in and around that project, definitely feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to, make connections, play that kind of, connecting role. And so don't hesitate to reach out, but also encourage folks to, do some research around who are your neighbors, what tribes have ancestral lands in a particular landscape or area that you're working on, and show up and say, make sure that you are communicating that they're part of your community and you would like to be part of theirs. A lot of tribes have open public events, big times or other events. That is a great way to just introduce yourself. It's a great way to show up and support tribes and their priorities in their space as well. And so while I'm happy to make an email introduction or make a connection, the real work actually is showing up, inviting folks to your meetings, showing up to their meetings, being a collaborative, hands-on partner. And tribes are wanting that. Tribes, we've been hearing in our consultations, they do actually want to partner with the conservation efforts that are being led by non-governmental entities across the state. And so there has been an explicit, we want to partner in these spaces. These spaces are important to us. We need to be at the table. We need to be part of the management of these spaces. And we're seeking those partnerships. So really encourage you folks to do that and reach out to your neighboring tribes.
Great. I'm going to head back to Sandy for one question, and if we get through it quickly, we'll go back to you, Geneva, for another one. But on the National Marine Sanctuary side of things, are there ways to strengthen those protections?
Yeah, there are a couple of ideas that the state's considering and that NRDC is considering. One could be within California has amazing national marine sanctuaries. They're extensive. And within those national marine sanctuaries in state waters, there are MPAs that have a more lenient level of protection. And so one option could be to sort of bolster the outside sanctuary by bringing up the level of protection within a state MPA. So that's one idea. There are also kind of special habitats within national marine sanctuaries in state water that might be good sort of blue carbon sequestration habitats where you could build in additional protections. And then we sort of love this idea of like a climate refugia within a national marine sanctuary. What that actually looks like, I think, is TBD, but I'll stop there in hopes that Geneva gets one more question.
Thank you. Thanks for that information, Sandy. I'm going to pass along that David has offered information on tribal EPA conference in October, hoping that CNRA can participate. And I've grabbed that content so I can share it with you, Geneva, later if you haven't seen that. But the last question is about CNRA emphasizing shared decision-making with tribes. And if that's the case, why focus only on consultation and not also on consent frameworks with tribes like pre, prior, and informed consent used in international forums? That might be a lofty question for the last 60 seconds here, but
that could be its own webinar. But the state is very well aware that we have not done consultations well in the past, and that sending a letter does not constitute meaningful consultation. And so we're actively shifting all of our policies and procedures to move away from the box checking, we sent you a letter type consultation, to actually early, often, and meaningful consultation with the end goal of collaborative partnership. And so that work is being done across the agency. I'm sure folks who are joining us today are well aware that the state does move slowly, but we are actively pushing to adjust all of our internal practices towards early, often and meaningful consultation with shared collaborative partnership and all the work that we do underneath the agency umbrella.
Great. Thank you again to Sandy and Geneva for your time today. To those working in the background, we appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you next month in September for another round of pathways being discussed. Have a great Thursday, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.